March 11, 1944. Paris firefighters are called to investigate smoke and a foul stench pouring from an abandoned house at 21 Rue Le Sueur. Inside, they uncover a scene straight out of a nightmare. The dismembered remains of 27 victims, a furnace still burning, and over 1,600 items of clothing, belonging to men, women, and even children. Many of them were Jewish families, desperate to escape the horrors of Nazi persecution. What they didn't know was that their trusted savior was secretly one of the most monstrous killers in history. Welcome to Dark Chronicles. This is the chilling story of Marcel Petiot, known as Dr. Satan, or as the newspapers called him, the French Hitler. In 1944, Paris was a city suffocating under the grip of Nazi occupation. Since June 1940, German forces had seized control of France, turning the once bustling capital into a city of fear and silence. The streets were lined with Nazi flags while German soldiers patrolled every corner. For ordinary citizens, life had become a daily battle for survival. Food was scarce. Long ration lines snaked through neighborhoods as Parisians waited hours for scraps of bread or meat. Fear of arrest hung over everyone, but it was especially acute for Jewish families. Their businesses were seized, their homes raided, and their loved ones disappeared into the night, sent to labor camps or worse. The Gestapo's presence in the city was relentless, and for those targeted, resistance fighters, Jews and other marginalized groups, escape was often their only hope. Networks of clandestine operators emerged, offering false papers, secret routes and promises of freedom across the borders to neutral countries like Switzerland or even across the Atlantic. But escape came at a high price. These operations were risky, expensive, and often exploited the desperation of those in need. Some networks were legitimate, run by brave men and women risking their lives to save others, but others were far more sinister, scams run by criminals looking to profit off the chaos of war. It was in this dark, desperate landscape that Marcel Petiot found his opportunity. To the outside world he was a compassionate doctor, someone who could be trusted in a time of crisis, but beneath the surface, he was watching, waiting and preying on those who sought his help. Petiot offered a deadly promise: salvation from the Gestapo. For many he seemed like their last chance. What they didn't know was that he was building a web of lies, a trap from which no one would escape. Marcel Petiot was born on January 17, 1897, in the small town of Auxerre, France, into a middle-class family. His father, Felix, worked in the postal service and eventually managed a local post office, while his mother, Marthe, was a homemaker. From an early age, Marcel stood out, both for his intelligence and for his troubling behavior. By the age of 5 he had mastered reading, far ahead of his peers. Teachers admired his intellect but noted a pattern of defiance. Marcel frequently disrupted class, showed no respect for authority, and exhibited an alarming interest in inappropriate topics. At the age of 11 he brought his father's gun to school and fired it in class, leading to his expulsion. In 1909, tragedy struck the family when Marcel's mother passed away while institutionalized for psychiatric issues. Marcel, already rebellious, became even more unmanageable. He and his younger brother moved with their father to Joigny, but his troubles escalated. By his teenage years he was stealing mail and breaking into homes, leading to his arrest at 17. A psychiatric evaluation diagnosed him with bipolar disorder and paranoia, declaring him legally irresponsible. This diagnosis shielded him from consequences, but it also hinted at deeper issues. At 19, Marcel enlisted in the French army during World War I. In 1917 he was injured by shrapnel and sent to a military hospital where he was accused of theft, stealing blankets and personal items from fellow soldiers. His behavior landed him in a psychiatric facility, where doctors diagnosed him with severe depression, paranoia, and neurasthenia. Despite these findings, he was sent back to the front lines, where he eventually shot himself in the foot to avoid further combat. This self-inflicted injury led to his discharge in 1918. After the war, Petiot benefited from a program for veterans, allowing him to fast-track his medical education. In 1921, he earned his degree and set up a practice in Villeneuve-sur-Yonne, a small provincial town. His charm and generosity quickly won over the community. Known for treating the poor free of charge, he became a trusted and beloved figure in the town. But cracks in his facade began to show. Rumors spread about his kleptomania. Patients reported valuables disappearing after house calls. Some also noted his eccentric and unpredictable behavior. While many admired him, others couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. These early signs of trouble hinted at a darker side of Petiot, one that would grow more pronounced as his influence expanded. He wasn't just a brilliant doctor, he was a man capable of deception, manipulation, and eventually, unimaginable violence. In Villeneuve-sur-Yonne, Marcel Petiot didn't just build a reputation as a skilled doctor, he also entered politics. By 1926 he was elected mayor, further cementing his status as a respected figure, but his tenure was anything but clean. Allegations of embezzlement, fraud, and abuse of power began to surface. Public funds went missing, and accusations of corruption grew louder with each passing year. The most chilling rumors, however, weren't about money. One day, Louisette, his housekeeper, disappeared without explanation. Neighbors noticed her absence, but Petiot offered no answers. Around the same time, a dairy caught fire and investigators found the body of a woman inside, dead by blunt force trauma. She was rumored to have been Petiot's mistress. Although no evidence directly tied him to the crime, the whispers in town painted a damning picture. By 1931, the pressure became too much. Petiot was forced to resign as mayor, but he managed to avoid prosecution. His lawyer skillfully navigated the accusations, allowing him to walk away unscathed. Yet his reputation in Villeneuve-sur-Yonne was tarnished, and it was clear that staying in the small town was no longer an option. In 1933, Petiot moved to Paris, leaving behind the scandals and suspicions. He opened a new medical practice in the heart of the city, using flashy advertisements to attract patients. He promised groundbreaking treatments and miraculous cures, catering to those desperate for relief. But his old habits followed him. Patients once again reported missing valuables, and his prescriptions often exploited his clients' vulnerabilities, pushing addictive substances under the guise of medical care. These early crimes, the thefts, the disappearances, the financial corruption, showed a man who thrived on exploiting those around him. While some dismissed him as eccentric or misunderstood, others began to suspect that Marcel Petiot was far more dangerous than anyone realized, and in Paris, with a larger stage and greater anonymity, he was preparing to unleash his darkest instincts. By the early 1940s, France was under Nazi occupation, and Paris had become a city of fear and desperation. For Jewish families, resistance fighters, and others marked as enemies of the Reich, escape was often the only hope of survival. In this environment, Marcel Petiot saw an opportunity, not to save lives but to exploit the vulnerable for his own gain. Petiot created what he called a network to freedom, promising safe passage to Argentina for those desperate to flee the Gestapo. He posed as a hero of the resistance, adopting the alias Dr. Eugene to maintain his anonymity. Through word of mouth and his recruiters, known as raboteurs, he convinced people to trust him. The operation seemed legitimate. Potential clients were told to bring their most valuable belongings as payment, including gold, jewelry, and cash. Victims were instructed to meet Petiot at his townhouse at 21 Rue Le Sueur, a property he had bought in 1941 and heavily renovated. Inside he had built a hidden executing ground. The house featured a gas chamber disguised as a disinfection room, complete with a peephole for observing victims. The basement contained a furnace, vats of quicklime, and tools for dismemberment. To the outside world it was an unassuming home. Inside it was a factory of death. Petiot's victims often included entire families, parents, children, and sometimes even grandparents. Once they arrived at the townhouse, Petiot would greet them warmly, reassuring them of their safety. He explained that before their journey, they would need vaccinations to protect them during their travels. The injections he administered, however, were lethal doses of cyanide. Within minutes, his victims were dead. What happened next was methodical and chilling. Petiot would strip the bodies of valuables, cataloging every piece of jewelry, clothing, or cash. He then disposed of the remains. Some were burned in his basement furnace, the smoke billowing from the chimney filling the neighborhood with its nauseating stench. Others were dissolved in quicklime or dismembered and thrown into the Seine. Over time, Petiot's greed and brutality escalated. He didn't limit his victims to those fleeing the Nazis. Criminals, rivals, and even acquaintances who threatened to expose him met the same fate. Among his victims were François Albertini, a Corsican gangster, Raoul Fourier, a barber, and Joseph Réaucru, a former boxer. Petiot's raboteurs who brought victims to him were likely unaware of the full extent of his crimes. They believed they were helping Jews and resistance members escape. But as the number of disappearances mounted, suspicions began to grow. Some questioned why no one seemed to return from the supposed escape network. Others noticed the constant smell of burning flesh emanating from the chimney at Rue Le Sueur. The sheer scale of Petitot's operation remained staggering. Police would later discover 665 kilograms of personal belongings, 72 suitcases, and countless pieces of clothing in his home. Among the items was a child's pajama set, a haunting reminder of the innocence stolen by his crimes. Despite his growing recklessness, Petitot operated undetected for years. The chaos of the war provided perfect cover, as many of his victims were already living in hiding or had few people to notice their disappearance. For Petitot, it was the perfect storm, a time when desperation blinded people to danger and trust became a deadly gamble. But even in a city as chaotic as Paris, the rumors couldn't stay buried forever. Neighbors began to complain about the foul-smelling smoke, and whispers about the mysterious disappearances reached dangerous ears. Soon, the Gestapo itself would take notice, marking the beginning of the end for Dr. Marcel Petitot and his deadly escape network. On March 11, 1944, the quiet streets of the 16th arrondissement in Paris were disturbed by the acrid, foul-smelling smoke wafting from the chimney of 21 Rue Le Sueur. For days, neighbors had complained about the nauseating stench, which only grew worse. That morning, firefighters were called to investigate what was presumed to be a chimney fire. When the firefighters arrived, they were immediately struck by the intensity of the odor. Breaking a window to gain entry, they were met with an eerie silence, save for the low rumble of a furnace operating at full blast. Following the sound, they descended into the basement, where they made a discovery that would haunt Paris for decades to come. The scene was nightmarish. The floor of the basement was littered with human remains, some dismembered, others partially burned. The furnace roared, its flames consuming body parts. Nearby, vats of quicklime sat bubbling, their contents a gruesome slurry of dissolved flesh and bones. Tools used for dismemberment lay scattered across the room, alongside piles of blood-stained rags. The firefighters immediately called the police, who launched a thorough investigation of the property. As they searched the house, more horrifying discoveries emerged. In one room they found what appeared to be a makeshift gas chamber, complete with a peephole in the door, suggesting that someone had watched the victims as they suffocated. In another room, they uncovered 665 kilograms of personal belongings, 72 suitcases, and countless articles of clothing, including women's dresses and a child's pajama set. The townhouse, once an unassuming residence, was revealed to be meticulously designed for his playing ground. It was a house built for slaughter, with every detail serving Petitot's horrifying purpose. Even the renovations he had undertaken in 1941, such as the addition of the furnace and the gas chamber, now took on a sinister significance. As the investigation continued, police uncovered more evidence of Petitot's crimes. Letters, documents, and photographs belonging to victims were scattered throughout the house, alongside piles of jewelry and gold coins. Among the belongings were identification papers for resistance members, Jewish families, and petty criminals, all of whom had trusted Petitot to help them escape. The scale of the operation was staggering. Authorities estimated that dozens, perhaps hundreds of victims had passed through the doors of 21 Rue Le Sueur, never to be seen again. But the most shocking revelation was this: the house belonged to Dr. Marcel Petitot, a respected general practitioner. Petitot, however, was nowhere to be found. When questioned, neighbors described Petitot as polite, charming, and seemingly harmless. Some recalled seeing him coming and going on his bicycle, always with a smile. No one could have imagined the horrors that had unfolded just behind those walls. News of the discovery spread quickly, and the media dubbed the mysterious doctor, Dr. Satan. The public was horrified and captivated in equal measure. The townhouse at Rue Le Sueur became infamous overnight, its gruesome secrets making headlines across France. But as the authorities pieced together the evidence, one question loomed larger than all others: where was Marcel Petitot? With his house of horrors exposed, Petitot had vanished into the chaos of wartime Paris. For the investigators, the hunt for one of history's most notorious killers was just beginning. With the horrors of 21 Rue Le Sueur exposed, authorities launched a massive manhunt to capture Marcel Petitot, now infamously known as Dr. Satan. As police combed through Paris for leads, Petitot had vanished into the chaos of Nazi-occupied France. His cunning use of false identities allowed him to stay hidden, even as his crimes became front-page news. For months, Petitot eluded capture, slipping through checkpoints and reinventing himself. At one point, He joined the French forces of the interior under the alias Captain Valery, presenting himself as a patriotic resistance fighter. Ironically, he worked as a military doctor, tending to injured fighters and gaining their trust, even as authorities across France hunted him as one of the most prolific killers in history. The breakthrough came when French intelligence published a scathing article in a resistance newspaper, accusing Petiot of being a Nazi informant. The article was a calculated trap. Enraged by the accusation, Petiot couldn't resist responding. He wrote a handwritten letter to the editor to defend his honor, but this mistake allowed investigators to identify his handwriting and pinpoint his location to the Paris region. On October 31, 1944, after months on the run, Petiot was arrested at a Paris metro station. Disguised and carrying false papers, he was apprehended without resistance. The authorities had finally captured their man, but the full scope of his crimes was still coming to light. As the investigation continued, police faced the grim task of identifying the victims whose remains were found at Rue Le Sueur. The property was filled with 665 kilograms of personal belongings, including 72 suitcases packed with clothes, jewelry, photographs, and documents. These items were carefully catalogued by authorities and displayed in public exhibitions, with the hope that family members or acquaintances could come forward to identify them. Crowds of Parisians lined up to view the exhibits, searching for any trace of missing loved ones. The process was heartbreaking. Families scoured through piles of clothing and personal effects, often finding only fragments of the lives they had lost. Among the items were children's pajamas, delicate jewelry, and personal letters, offering glimpses into the lives Petiot had so cruelly taken. This painstaking work led to the identification of several victims, including members of the Braunberger family, the Neller family, and numerous individuals who had sought Petiot's help to escape Nazi persecution. But for many others, their names and stories were lost forever, their fates swallowed by the chaos of war. The trial of Marcel Petiot opened on March 18, 1946, and quickly became a national spectacle. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, eager to see the man behind the horrors. Inside, Petiot faced charges for 27 murders, though investigators believed the true number of victims could exceed 100. Petiot's behavior during the trial was as bizarre as it was chilling. He mocked the prosecution, cracked jokes, and even fell asleep during proceedings. Far from expressing remorse, he insisted he was a resistance hero, claiming that his victims were Nazis, collaborators, or criminals. He argued that he had killed in service of France, not out of greed or malice. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Police presented the personal belongings found at Rue Le Sueur, including photographs and identification documents. Witnesses testified about his role in arranging the disappearances, and forensic experts detailed the horrors of his basement, from the furnace to the gas chamber. The most haunting piece of evidence was the child's pajama set, a stark reminder of the innocence stolen in Petiot's crimes. The presence of children among his victims destroyed any credibility in his claims of killing only enemies of France. On April 4, 1946, after weeks of harrowing testimony and damning evidence, Marcel Petiot was found guilty of 24 murders. While investigators believed he had killed far more, potentially over 100, the evidence could only definitively link him to these cases. As the judge delivered the verdict, the courtroom sat in heavy silence. Petiot, however, showed no remorse. Instead, he smirked, maintaining his unsettling composure as if the proceedings were little more than a theatrical performance. The trial had gripped the nation, exposing not only the depth of Petiot's crimes but also the chilling charisma that allowed him to manipulate and deceive so many. Throughout the proceedings, he had portrayed himself as a patriotic hero, claiming that all his victims were Nazis, collaborators, or criminals. But the evidence told a different story. Of families, children, and desperate individuals who had placed their trust in him only to meet horrifying ends. As his sentence, death by guillotine, was announced, Petiot reportedly shrugged, a faint smile on his lips. His arrogance persisted until the very end. On the morning of May 25, 1946, at 5:05 a.m., Marcel Petiot was awakened in his cell at La Sainte prison to face his execution. He was described as calm, even dismissive. His lawyer, Maître René Fleuriot, entered to bid him farewell, but Petiot reportedly greeted him with a groggy, irritated grumble. "You're annoying me." Escorted by guards to the guillotine in the prison courtyard, Petiot maintained his composure. Witnesses described his demeanor as unnervingly relaxed, as if he were heading to an ordinary appointment rather than his death. A small group of officials and journalists were present, as public executions had been outlawed in France years earlier. The air was thick with tension as they awaited the final moments of the man who had terrorized a nation. When asked if he had any final words, Petiot delivered one last chilling quip: "I am a traveler taking my luggage with me." It was a cryptic, almost poetic statement reminiscent of other infamous last words. Some believed it was a veiled reference to his crimes, mocking the victims he had sent to their deaths under the guise of escape. Others saw it as the final act of a man who thrived on manipulation and theatricality. At 5:13 a.m. the blade fell, ending the life of one of France's most notorious killers. Witnesses later remarked on how serene Petiot appeared, his smirk frozen in death, a fitting end for a man whose lack of remorse had defined his trial. The execution of Marcel Petiot closed a dark chapter in French history, but his crimes left an enduring legacy. In the years that followed, investigators continued to uncover the names of potential victims, though many remained unidentified. The personal belongings recovered from Rue Le Sueur were eventually returned to families, providing a small measure of closure for those who had lost loved ones. Petiot's psychological profile became a subject of intense study. Was he truly insane, or was his behavior the calculated cruelty of a cold-blooded sociopath? Psychiatrists who evaluated him before his trial agreed that he was fully aware of his actions, labeling him a manipulative narcissist who exploited the chaos of war to satisfy his greed and sadistic impulses. Comparisons were often drawn between Petiot and other infamous killers, such as Henri Désir Landru or the American H.H. Holmes. Like them, Petiot combined charm, intelligence, and opportunity to prey on his victims. His ability to deceive even the most cautious individuals highlighted the dangers of blind trust in times of desperation. To this day, the story of Marcel Petiot continues to captivate and horrify. His crimes serve as a chilling reminder of how easily evil can hide behind a mask of respectability, and how desperation can make even the most discerning individuals vulnerable to manipulation. In the end, Marcel Petiot wasn't just a killer, he was a symbol of the darkest corners of human nature, a man who thrived on the suffering of others and left a legacy that France would never forget. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this story is how easily Petiot hid in plain sight. A doctor, a mayor, a supposed resistance hero, his titles and charm masked the atrocities he committed. And though justice ultimately caught up with him, the scars of his crimes lingered in the memories of those he betrayed. One last mystery stays: where is the wealth stolen from the victims, estimated for over $60 million? Well, this is the last mystery that Petiot brought with him in the grave. If you found this story compelling, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Who do you think Marcel Petiot truly was? A man driven by greed, or a killer shaped by his own mental instability? I'd love to hear your perspective, and as always, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, share it with others who love true crime and historical mysteries, and hit that subscribe button to join me for more dark and intriguing tales. Stay curious, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.